There was a time in the United States when a single name was enough to ignite fear, respect, or hope, depending on who spoke it. That name was Malcolm X. For some, he was a dangerous radical. For others, a prophetic voice saying out loud what no one dared even think. But what almost no one knew was that Malcolm wasn't born revolutionary. He was born broken, and he rebuilt himself with pieces that hurt. Before he became the symbol of a wounded nation, he was Malcolm Little, a boy who learned far too early what it meant to be black in a white world. He lost his father, was torn from his family, fell into crime, and experienced prison. It was behind bars that he found not just a new name, but reason to rise up. What followed was a transformation that challenged everyone: his people, his enemies, his own allies, and himself. This isn't just a portrait of a murdered leader. It's the story of a soul that burned in search of meaning, a man who spoke of love while drowning in rage, who sought justice in a world without compassion, and who, in the end, was silenced just when he begun to understand what he really wanted to say. Get ready to journey through the life of Malcolm X as never before, from the shadows that shaped him to the light that almost redeemed him. Because behind the firm gesture, the fiery speeches, and the dangerous fame, there was a human being searching for himself. Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, in an America that made no effort to hide its racial hatred. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and a fervent supporter of Marcus Garvey, the leader of the Back to Africa movement. That didn't make him popular among white people, or even among some black people. From the moment he was born, Malcolm was seen as a threat in the eyes of the system. His house was attacked by white supremacists. His family lived on the run. Violence wasn't a possibility. It was daily life. When Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father was found dead. Officially, it was an accident, but the body, mangled by a streetcar and showing signs of having been beaten beforehand, told another story, one the police never cared to investigate. Earl's death left the Little family adrift and unprotected. Louise, Malcolm's mother, of black and white descent, faced racism with as much dignity as she could, raising 8 children while the state watched her as if she were a threat. The pressure eventually broke her. Over the years, she ended up institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital. Malcolm was separated from his siblings and sent to foster homes. The message was clear. The system didn't just want to silence voices. It wanted to break generations. Despite his sharp intelligence, Malcolm received a cruel reminder at school. No matter how much he excelled, his skin color was a sentence. A teacher told him that his dream of becoming a lawyer was not realistic for a black boy. That's when he realized that the straight path had no open doors for him, that the rules were made for someone else. This childhood, marked by uprooting, loss, and humiliation, became the breeding ground for deep resentment, not an irrational hatred, but a structured fury forged by injustice. Malcolm learned early on that behaving wasn't enough to survive, that obedience didn't save his own, and that maybe crime was just the language the world had taught him. Thus began the story of a brilliant child whom the world forced to choose between disappearing or resisting. When Malcolm left behind his broken childhood, it wasn't for a safe haven. It was for Harlem. In the 1940s, Harlem was both a hotbed of culture and a pit of despair for young black men. There, among jazz clubs, underground gambling, and streets patrolled by corrupt police, Malcolm found something he had never felt before, a sense of belonging. He swapped books for dice, desks for street corners. He reinvented himself as Detroit Red, a nickname that alluded to his reddish hair and streetwise style. He was clever, quick, charming. He sold marijuana, trafficked alcohol, stole watches, and moved effortlessly among thieves, musicians, and prostitutes. For him, crime wasn't a fall. It was a rise within the only system that would have him. Malcolm didn't live in the shadow of racism. He used it as fuel. If the world saw him as a criminal because of the color of his skin, then he would become the best criminal. His intelligence, sharpness, and ability to read people made him a perfect actor in Harlem's underground theater. But beneath that vibrant facade hid a deep emptiness, one that no jazz night or water bills could ever fill. The breaking point came in 1946. He was barely 20 when he was arrested for armed robbery. The system that had raised him with contempt now locked him up with brutality. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although the trial was quick, the verdict was the same as always. A young black man didn't need proof to be guilty. He just needed to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. Prison wasn't hell. It was a pause. For the first time, Malcolm faced silence. Routine. The lack of escape. That confinement forced him to look inward, where there were still embers of something more than rage. Embers of identity, of history, of a faith he didn't know yet, but that was beginning to call to him from deep inside. Sometimes, to find a way, you have to hit bottom. And Malcolm didn't just hit it, he lived there. But in that place, he also discovered he could rebuild himself, that his story didn't have to end behind bars, if he was capable of being reborn. And what do you think? Does the system create criminals, or does it condemn them before they're even born? Charlestown prison was tough, but Malcolm was already used to hardship. What he didn't expect was to face silence. The streets were full of noise, speed, and adrenaline. Inside, time crawled by like an invisible snake. Without mirrors to distract you, confinement forces you to look within. And Malcolm began to do just that. At first, there was only anger. Anger at being there, at having fallen, at having been caught. Anger at the system, yes, but also at himself. Then came denial, pride, the facade. But little by little, something else began to seep in. Reading. It was thanks to Bimby, a fellow inmate with more wisdom than arrogance, that Malcolm rediscovered the power of words. He started with a dictionary, copying out word for word in a notebook, not to learn how to read, but to learn how to think. What followed was an almost obsessive devotion to reading: history, philosophy, sociology, religion. Malcolm devoured books like a man searching for air underwater. He discovered colonialism, slavery, systemic oppression, and he understood that these weren't the system's mistakes. They were its logical consequence. But it wasn't just books that sparked his awakening. It was in prison that he first heard the name Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, a religious movement that mixed spirituality, discipline, and a fierce critique of the white man as a historic oppressor of black people. For many, it was extremism. For Malcolm, it was as if everything finally made sense. From prison, he began to correspond with Elijah Muhammad. In those letters, he found direction, purpose, an identity he'd always been denied. He rejected his surname Little, a symbol of imposed slavery, and embraced X as a declaration of the unknown. The stolen name, the lost lineage, the silenced history. When he was released in 1952, he was no longer Detroit Red. He was Malcolm X. And he wasn't seeking money, fame, or forgiveness. He was seeking something far more dangerous: to awaken minds. His own first, then the world's. When Malcolm X left prison, he didn't return to the streets. He stepped onto the stage of a revolution. He officially joined the Nation of Islam, an organization that didn't just preach the spiritual superiority of black people, but denounced with surgical clarity the structural roots of racism in the United States. They didn't ask for integration. They asked for separation. And more than that, power. Under Elijah Muhammad's leadership, the Nation of Islam offered something many black men had never felt in their country: dignity. They had their own schools, their own businesses, their own rules. It was a kind of republic within an empire, and Malcolm quickly became its brightest messenger. His oratory was like fire. He didn't just speak eloquently. He spoke truth. Every word had an edge. Every pause was a sentence. He didn't beg for rights. He demanded justice. He mocked the American dream, called it a nightmare. He denounced white violence with a clarity most were afraid to voice. And where Martin Luther King preached love for the enemy, Malcolm talked about self-defense, about pride, about memory. The media both loved and feared him. In every interview, Malcolm dismantled trick questions with fierce intelligence. He didn't seek to please. He sought to awaken. His presence was magnetic, uncomfortable, necessary. Soon, he became the most visible face of the Nation of Islam, and that rise brought not only admirers, but enemies, many of them within his own house. But at that moment, Malcolm didn't know it. He only knew he had a purpose, and that for the first time in his life, he felt the whole world needed to hear him, because the time for silence was over, and he hadn't been born to obey. He had been born to say what no one wanted to hear. His speeches crossed borders, inspiring young people from Harlem to Johannesburg. But with every word he spoke, he also dug a chasm between whites and blacks, between integration and separation, and unknowingly between himself and the man he so deeply admired. If this story is stirring something inside you, subscribe. There's much more to discover. And tell me, is freedom built from love or from rage? Malcolm X became an inescapable symbol, the voice that no one could ignore, even if many wished they could silence him. But what was behind that imposing figure? The speaker who electrified crowds and stirred minds. There was a man who knew how to channel the pain, frustration, and rage of a community trampled for centuries. His message was raw, direct, and often controversial. He spoke openly about institutional racism, the hypocrisy of the system, and the need for a deep revolution, not just social, but spiritual. He called for self-defense with firmness, rejected passivity, and scorned integration that didn't come with real justice. For many, he was a preacher of hate, a threat to peace. For others, a beacon of hope. In his rise, Malcolm learned how to move among the lights and shadows of power. In the 1950s and 60s, his presence not only shocked black neighborhoods across the United States, but also unsettled Washington and the intelligence agencies. The FBI kept a close eye on him, fearing that his influence could grow enough to destabilize the established order. Yet despite the fame and notoriety, Malcolm remained a man in conflict with himself and his allies. His loyalty to Elijah Muhammad was unwavering, but doubts began to creep in. The spiritual leader had dark secrets and a personal life full of contradictions that undermined the moral authority of the movement. Meanwhile, Malcolm also faced pressure from the black community itself, torn between King's peaceful path and the radicalism he represented. That tension played out in public debates, ideological clashes, and a silent struggle for the future of racial activism. Behind the powerful voice and charismatic figure, there was a man who was starting to question his own beliefs. Fame gave him power, but it also brought him closer to the precipice of betrayal that no one saw coming. The shine of the Nation of Islam began to show cracks when Malcolm X discovered secrets that shook his faith and loyalty. Rumors of personal scandals involving Elijah Muhammad, from forbidden relationships to contradictions between his words and actions, began to surface. For a man who preached strict discipline and morality, those revelations were an internal earthquake. The trust Malcolm had placed in his leader slowly, but definitively broke. He began to question not just Elijah's authority, but also the movement's strategy and dogmas. His personal evolution, fueled by new readings and contexts, opened a rift that widened quickly. His growing independence and critical voice provoked irreparable tensions with the Nation of Islam. Malcolm was no longer just a spokesperson. He was an independent thinker, a man demanding changes the organization was unwilling to make. The split was inevitable. The impact of that separation was more than political or spiritual. It was personal and dangerous. Malcolm became a target, not only of his former allies, but of an entire system that saw in his transformation a threat capable of inspiring millions. But the rupture also opened unexpected doors. Malcolm began to connect with leaders from other currents of civil rights movement and, above all, with a deeper understanding of our shared humanity. His journey was far from over, and the search for a broader truth even took him to Mecca, a journey that would forever change his view of the world. Do you want to keep discovering Malcolm X beyond the myth? Subscribe so you don't miss a thing. And tell me, Is it possible to turn hate into true love, or only into an endless struggle? In 1964, Malcolm X undertook one of the most decisive journeys of his life, the pilgrimage to Mecca. It was a journey that not only crossed physical borders, but shattered the walls of his most deeply held beliefs. There, among thousands of Muslims of all colors and cultures, Malcolm experienced an epiphany that transformed his view of the world and of the fight for equality. Until that moment, his activism had been tinged by a message of racial separation and unyielding resistance. But in Mecca, he saw unity, brotherhood, and genuine equality beyond the surface differences of skin or nation. He understood that the fight should not be just against the white oppressor, but against all forms of injustice and division. This spiritual awakening reshaped his message and his strategy. Malcolm began to speak of a more inclusive activism, of a human revolution that transcended race and embraced universal justice. He left behind dogmatic rigidity to adopt a broader, more compassionate approach, though without losing the strength and determination that had always defined him. However, not everyone welcomed this change. His former allies saw him as a traitor, a man who had abandoned the real fight, and his enemies, fearful of his growing influence, began to plan his definitive silence. Malcolm had ceased to be just a black leader. He had become a global voice, a symbol of transformation, but also a moving target, vulnerable and marked. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X took the stage at the Audubon Ballroom in New York, surrounded by his wife Betty and his daughters. What seemed like just another speech about rights and hope quickly turned into tragedy. In a matter of seconds, the leader who had challenged everyone was struck down by a hail of bullets in front of his family and hundreds of witnesses. Malcolm was only 39 years old, but he had lived several lifetimes. His murder, orchestrated in shadows of conspiracy and rivalry, was the end of a life in constant evolution, marked by breakages and reinventions. The subsequent investigations never unraveled all the threads of the plot, whether it was just internal revenge in the Nation of Islam, a personal vendetta, or a silencing orchestrated by forces much larger that feared the reach of his new voice. In the days and weeks that followed, thousands came to say goodbye. The image of his wife, dignified and shattered, holding their daughters, was seared into collective memory. The press, the state, and even those who had once been his enemies couldn't ignore the symbolic weight of his death. A man had fallen, but a legend was born. The legacy of Malcolm X is neither simple nor comfortable. It is the echo of a radical transformation that challenges anyone looking for easy answers. It is proof that redemption and true change have a price, and that in the fight for justice, no path is free from contradictions. Until the end, Malcolm X chose to own his truth. He preferred to fall standing than live on his knees. His story doesn't end at the Audubon Ballroom. It continues to spark questions, debates, and personal journeys around the world. Because every time someone decides to break the mold and dares to change, the spirit of Malcolm X walks among us again.